Everything that falls under the category of organism exists in a state of contingency on the basic principles of equilibrium, which can be defined as the condition of a system in which competing influences are balanced, resulting in no net change. In the course of an organism's life, extremes can be and are reached, but it is in the nature of the organism to revert back to a state of balance. Social organisms, and by this I mean society, function in much the same way, though admittedly there is never a perfectly objective homeostasis that can automatically be returned to after dipping into extremes. More often than not, in social and cultural matters, the pendulum swings such that maintaining equilibrium is impossible, because whatever extreme had previously been in place generates the opposite, another extreme, which in many ways describes the current political climate of our time, though that is a topic for another session. Still, the analogy is not that far off in the sense that a society lives and dies by how well it regulates itself to maintain its homeostasis and equilibrium. And it is here that we come to the question and matter of complementarianism, specifically male and female complementarianism. There tend to be two sides to this argument when discussing the topic, usually two extremes. One side argues that men and women are fundamentally incompatible and do not complement each other at all, and this view is typically expressed by the extremes of feminism, and the extremes that are sometimes even found in the manosphere as well. The proponents of this view assert that, functionally, men and women are each other's enemies, or at the very least opposed to each other in some essential way. The opposite extreme, most frequently proposed by people on the right, and a traditional bent, sometimes referred to as traditionalists in certain circles, is that men and women need each other, that they are perfectly complementary in physiology and psychology, and that few to any problems would exist were it not for the specter of feminism and cultural Marxism. As you might have guessed, I believe that neither is true. The too long didn't read version would be that men and women are complementary in some ways, and in other ways not so much. But that would be insufficient to explain what is actually afoot in the current social climate. To begin with, going back to the concept of equilibrium, let us talk for a little bit about ecosystems. Now, the strict definition of an ecosystem would be a system that includes all living organisms, which are biotic factors in an area, as well as its physical environment, abiotic factors, that function together as a unit. The final phrase, as a unit, is critical here, because it implies correctly that all parts, biotic and abiotic, are required for a functional ecosystem, meaning that the imbalances and disruptions in the ecology of an ecosystem can lead to destruction, and sometimes lasting damage, if not permanent damage. When we examine the biotic factors that comprise an ecosystem, we should take note of some of the relationships that exist between the organisms that form said ecosystem. Take, for instance, the African savanna, and the relationship between, say, a lion and a gazelle. Both are important parts of the ecosystem, yet in terms of their relationship, they are functional enemies, in a sense, as the gazelle is often a food item for the lion. Do they complement each other, though? Absolutely, because if you were to severely cripple the gazelle population, or any herbivore population in that context, the carnivore population, including lions, would suffer, and large parts of the ecosystem would begin to unravel. There is an interdependency and complementarianism that exists for both the lion and the gazelle, but they are more often than not at odds with each other. Under- or overpopulation of either would have significant negative consequences for the ecosystem they are part of. Human social systems are ecosystems in their own right, and like the lion and gazelle, there exist both interdependent and complementary elements within the part of the ecosystem we call male-female relations. It is at this stage that I would like to discard the question of compatibility and complementarianism, in part because I think I have demonstrated that equilibrium within an ecosystem is a much better way of viewing male-female relations, if only because the complementary and compatible, in this context, are absolutely impossible to measure in any relevant quantifiable way. So, for example, are lions and zebras 65% complementary and 35% non-complementary? Are jaguars and tapirs in the Amazon 50% complementary and non-complementary? It is a functionally useless question, in the context of other animal life, and it is functionally useless in the context of a human animal, even if it does make for interesting rhetorical baubles that ideologues of many stripes toss to their respective masses. So the real question is not whether or not women and men are complementary, and to what degree, but rather to what degree they exist in equilibrium to each other. And it is here that we have to delve into the very different psychological and biological portraits that men and women offer us. Though there is some basic overlap in the physiological and psychological requirements of both men and women, and both sexes generally seek to replicate their DNA, when it comes to how they approach these things, there are great differences. For the longest time, the environment that humans inhabited proved to be the best tool in maintaining a socio-biological equilibrium, in that its harshness and the restrictions it placed on both men and women prevented granting either sex too great an advantage, and it forced men and women to cooperate, even if and when that cooperation was not a particularly happy one. The exigencies of the environment required it. Despite this, we know from the genetic record that throughout our history, women have been in their totality more reproductively successful than men have been in their totality, ultimately derived from the single fact that they possess wombs and men do not. Or put more simply, eggs are expensive, sperm is cheap. From this very simple formula, human beings have crafted a complex social system of interlocking and interdependent bits and parts, and necessary codependency between the sexes. Environmental constraints have always been the largest obstacle to women, as well as their own physiology and psychology, including such things as menstruation, the dangers of childbirth, greater physical weakness, neuroticism, and greater timidity. At the same time, such obstacles created immense dependency on male activity and engagement, and this, coupled by an unforgiving environment, prevented humans' natural inclination to favor women in terms of health, survival and well-being, and reproduction from growing to excess, at least partly. This state, which was the state that both men and women had existed in since Homo sapiens first came onto the scene, was the one in which we evolved, and continue to evolve in for most of our species' existence. Women's limitations, along with environmental constraints, prevented the basic social equilibrium that existed between men and women from shifting too far one way or another, and this included the natural inclination most human beings feel, including both men and women, to prefer the personal flourishing of women over men. When the Industrial Revolution hit, and the even more impactful biotechnology of the 20th century hit even harder, all the constraints that had been held in place and held back for untold millennia were thrown away. This mechanization effect led to and accelerated the greatest series of maladaptive behavior that humans had ever experienced, and threw open the doors for unending munificence towards women, with no concomitant change in people's attitudes towards men, which is to say that the desire to prefer women in the most salient ways of life, in health, in providing services, in kowtowing to their demands, these were all accelerated to a degree hitherto unseen in history or prehistory. Sometimes, as a total package, we call this gynocentrism. It was probably the case that gynocentrism was a biological necessity throughout human history, because of just how difficult and tough life was. But we were never primed to live in the now in this sense, nor were our psychological inclinations adaptive enough to be optimized to deal with a world of the sort we live in, which is why we needn't talk about complementarianism at all. That's just a political tool. Yes, for the purposes of reproduction, men and women need each other. Yes, prehistorically and historically, they had to cooperate. But when massive sweeping changes have taken hold of society, and at the macro level, our overly positive feelings towards women run into excess in the form of endless help in school and education, health, politics, marriage, and fertility, and just about every other life-relevant matter, this can only be described as a disequilibrium, and unsurprisingly, this disequilibrium is leading to the slow collapse of our social ecosystem. In nature, when an ecosystem loses the homeostatic balance it requires to be maintained, there tends to be massive loss until stabilization occurs. Species can and do go extinct in the interim, and it usually takes an exceptionally long time to repair damage done. In some cases, if we are talking about mass extinction events, which effectively disrupt the largest ecosystem known, namely the planetary ecosystem, the recovery period can take millions of years. Of course, whatever parallels there might be between real-world natural ecosystems And the social ecosystems we construct, albeit with biological dependencies built into them, they are not perfect analogs. There's also no precedent for the current disruption being experienced in our societal ecosystem in the form of distorted sexual markets, social expectations, legal interference in mating procedures, education, and the list goes on and on. All things which largely tilt the balance in favor of women. Whilst it is true that there are complementary elements that exist between men and women, the evolutionary directives that drive the two sexes can often push them in opposite directions, leading to distinct disadvantages. In the past, any disadvantages women experience were almost entirely due to their own physiological limitations in relation to the environment, which constrain most of the changes we can bear witness to today, and on a macro level, the pendulum has swung almost fully in their favor. The disadvantages that men experience in the current environment, however, are largely due to a combination of social and policy change, as well as radical shifts in the forms of technology we use. Which is to say that advancing civilization forward, almost paradoxically and strangely, seems to leverage the playing field in favor of women and in the disfavor of men. One thing I have talked about previously is that there has been a hollowing out of the middle, and in this sense, by way of analogy, one can again look to ecosystems. The megafauna exist at the top end of the ecosystem, and the microfauna at the bottom, which here analogizes to the upper crust of society and the bottommost dregs of society, or in other words, the far right and left tails of the bell curve, respectively. And most important, there are all those animals that exist somewhere between these two extremes. Without this mesofauna, as I will refer to it, neither extreme can properly persist, but when it comes to men specifically, it is primarily the broad middle that is most affected by all the changes we have talked about for years. It is being hollowed out. We may be experiencing a first in human history, where the least competent reproduce the most due to artificial assistance, and the most competent reproduce few, and those in the middle will be increasingly squeezed out of the mating market, with the longest term net result that the ecological dependencies on both tail ends of the distribution curve losing the people they are most dependent on. The megafauna requires the mesofauna to perform labor and to maintain societal stability and to occupy the domains that they have created, and the microfauna requires both to maintain an otherwise unstable existence due to natural-born yet unfortunate incompetence. Whilst the proportions of what I've been speaking of have been very much localized in the sense that they disproportionately affect the West, it is likely only a matter of time until this socio-ecological crisis reaches a planetary basis, given the relentless spread of technology, which has been instrumental in replicating most of the changes that had led to the present-day disequilibrium in the West. Men and women are sufficiently different in their needs and wants that over-favoring one side can lead to the majority's disenfranchisement of the other if one extreme, in this case the gynocentric one, is pursued to the detriment of the other. Once enough damage is done, repair in the sense of returning to what was will become an impossibility, and we can only look forward, if that phrase is even appropriate, to an ever-widening and expanding disequilibrium that has rent our society in twain and pushed most men, that is, men in the middle, to its outermost margins. It is a brave new world, but not the one that had been envisioned. Thank you very much for watching. As YouTube has demonetized this channel, it now operates solely off of the generosity and contributions of its subscribers. Please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Any and all support is more than appreciated. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.